Okay, we are live on YouTube with the March 27th meeting of the Node.js modules team. Woo! We're joined by 13 different members, including 12 voting members, so we have an overwhelming amount of consensus going on, a quorum, hopefully consensus as well. So with that Freudian slip out of the way, let's chop right into things. We have, for those of you following along at home, an implementation upstream that we're working on with the phase 2 implementation that we've reached consensus on within the group. This PR was opened 2 weeks ago after the last meeting. There were some upstream changes that were requested, the majority of which were kind of internals in implementation and non-controversial. But 2 of the changes end up being a little bit more substantive, specifically the upstream objection to --type as a flag and the upstream objection to -m. I think that for what it's worth, depending on where we're all at, I think we'd probably be better off not spending too much time on these in the beginning of the meeting, and we could talk more about things moving forward. The purpose of these early on is just to make sure everyone's aware of it and has a chance to voice an opinion. In the current implementation that is upstream, type has been changed to entry type to be more explicit to the behavior that exists right now, which is that with that flag, we only change the behavior for like how we assume a module is when we try to run it with Node. It doesn't make any sort of recursive changes to subsequent imports. We have a bunch of things on the agenda about digging into that behavior and maybe changing it. But are there any objections to the change that we made to making it entry type? Okay, cool. So there's no objections to moving forward with that. The other one was the upstream objection to including -m. Without digging too much into it, the simple thing that we did for right now is just assume we do not have consensus on -m. We removed it from the current implementation, and we can revisit adding -m as an alias in a follow-up PR. Does anyone have any problems with that substantive change? Okay, excellent. As we have no objections to either of those, I am under the impression that we can move forward. Now, the only other thing in the upstream bit that got changed kind of in the 0th hour right now, and Jeff and I were commenting on it, is there was a request from upstream because we renamed type to entry type to rename the type type mismatch error to entry type mismatch, which itself is maybe not entirely accurate because, as Jeff pointed out, it's possible that this would throw based on other cases. I did change it based on the upstream request, and I figure that this is an easy thing for us to iterate upstream. Does anyone object to us just making that change to the error name and then just iterating on it as we figure out how we want to handle type?
It seems pretty clear that we all are interested in having the names match their semantics and that we can freely change those things as we discover mismatches. So it seems fine to make those changes in the future.
Okay. Jeff, in particular, I just want to make sure you're okay with it.
Yeah, I don't care. Like, whatever. I think they are misunderstanding what it means, but I don't care. If they find this is a better name.
It's a free upstream commit against Node Core to anyone from the team who wants to fix that after this lands. Okay, cool.
No, Jeffrey's making a good point. That's all.
Say that one more time, Guy. Do you think that we should change it back to type?
Yeah, I think entry type could be confusing for people seeing it, but it's a super minor thing. And yeah, we can change all this stuff. So I'm not too worried.
Okay, cool. I prefer to just have it be...
There's a thing that's in the notes that says error type, and that's what I heard too. Are we talking about the same thing?
Yeah, so there's an error called type mismatch, which throws when you have a mismatch between the type itself, and the type that's passed to type, or the type that's in the package JSON, and what you're importing and how you're using it. Okay. I believe that that's only for the entry point, but there's like subtlety to it that I think the argument is that neither name is really entirely accurate. One is a little bit more descriptive, but wrong in certain edge cases, and the other one is a little too broad. And either one is kind of not exactly good enough, and we can just improve it.
I think for the purposes of upstream, it doesn't matter. I think there's a good chance we change the flag in general, as I'm assuming we're going to talk about later. So, yeah, you know, I would say let's get this merged in, and then we could discuss more broadly how to deal with this stuff.
Okay, cool. So with that being said, then I think we can move on from that item and move on to the next agenda item, which is tracking upstream PR. This is just a really, really quick one. Just as a heads up to everyone, what I have done is what was originally in our fork about like 30 to 33 commits. I folded down into about like I think it was maybe 10 commits to make reviewing a bit easier. Those commits kind of changed over the last 2 weeks as we made specific changes. As of today, I went through and I folded everything into a single commit. It includes inside of the commit message, more or less like an updated version of what the PR message was. It includes references to a variety of the different PRs that made it, as well as a variety of the various like kind of specs and things that we're referencing. And it also includes a handful of co-authors. Right now, the co-authors that are on it include Guy Bedford is the primary author, and then I'm a co-author, John David Dalton is a co-author, Evan Place is a co-author, Jeffrey Booth is a co-author, and Michael Zasso is a co-author. Those are all the individuals who had explicitly like sent commits. Are people okay with that? Should we add everyone from the team as co-authors potentially? Or I was kind of keeping it to the people who actually had substantive code that went in there. Does anyone object? I'll just make it really simple, and I'll drop that commit into the chat right now. Does anyone object to the commit that I just posted landing on Node.js master? Okay, cool. We've done it. The PR has no current upstream objections. It has a conversation of 190 different messages, and it's currently sitting with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 upstream approvals, including multiple TSC members. I have one last CI job that's running right now, which hopefully may even wrap up before the end of this meeting, in which case I will screen share and ceremoniously land the commit, and we can all celebrate. With that being said, congratulations, everyone. We have done the first bit. Okay, on to the next work. So we have a handful of different items in here in different orders, and we can kind of visit these in a different order depending on how things are going. I kind of just threw them in there and tried to kind of stack rank. Oh wait, Gus, you just said, hold on, we forgot something. What did we forget? Or is the -S sarcasm?
Sarcasm. Okay,
cool. And then Jeremiah, you'd rather not be listed if things turn what way? I'm trying to understand.
Oh, I mean, if I don't think we're discussing really doing that anyways, but I don't want really to be listed because I haven't really done anything on the code. If you were listed everyone.
Yeah, let's just keep to the names that were listed in there because those are people who had commits that got squashed in. I think that's pretty fair. Kind of the first thing I wanted to get into here is what's next for the team. So the first bit that I want to kind of bring up is the moratorium. And I would like to propose that we drop the upstream moratorium for right now. We now have these changes that have landed. It's highly, highly likely that there's going to be quick iteration that we're going to want to do, especially leading up to 12 for bugs that are found. I personally make a pledge to not allow large substantive changes to the implementation itself through without bringing it to the team to discuss it. But I do think now that we have landed these changes, and for the most part, the work that we've done on the fork has been upstreamed, I don't think that there's a need for the moratorium itself. Does anyone object to dropping the moratorium?
I guess I'm just curious, in terms of Semver, it seems like there's no reason that there should be a moratorium on Semver patch changes. Mm-hmm. But minor and major changes are things that it would probably be ideal if we had some sort of policy that like the moratorium that kept us in the loop for it. So is it possible we could just word it that way?
I think this gets into a bit of a deeper question for us to have about the role of this team moving forward. So I think it goes without saying that there has been friction the last couple of weeks in kind of getting this over the finish line, and I personally have been a little bit disappointed with the way in which things have had to move in order for us to reach some degree of consensus. Perhaps this discussion about the moratorium is part of a bigger conversation about what is our role as a team moving forward now and what are the expectations. So perhaps without me kind of airing the conversation in a particular direction based on my bias, to the team itself, to those of you who have been doing the work and want to continue doing the work, what do you think the role of the modules team should be now? We've got, Gus, you have your hand up?
Hello. I mean, just from my perspective, I feel like it would be more efficient and I don't know, just easier on people if we just kind of if all the people interested in working on this, just if we just move over to core really. Now that we've kind of gotten the new thing in, I feel like it'll be a lot more, it'll create a lot less friction if we continue iterating in core directly. We can still have the group, but I think we should be working a little bit more closely with the rest of the core collaborators and everything at this point.
Yeah, and I think for what it's worth, Gus, a lot of what I was kind of erring towards is a shift in the mental model of how we work and working less in a fork and working more as a special interest group working directly upstream. Jordan, you had your hand up?
Yeah, so I guess two things. With that clarification.
And then Jeffrey, you're next.
So the first thing is with that clarification, that's just how the work is done, or which GitHub repo it's done in or whatever. And when I'm thinking of moratorium, I'm not thinking of nothing can land in master as much as I'm thinking of it would be ideal if the modules team, by whatever process we've already deemed fit, were required to approve of any modules changes in master, even if that's the only place we directly iterate. Mm-hmm.
But the reality, Jordan, is that unless we are chartered,
right,
we cannot make a claim like that. And up until now, the only reason why that has not been happening has been in good faith.
Right. So, and that's, I realize that by not being chartered, the moratorium is essentially a gift that Node Core has given us. I'm saying, could we perhaps ask for a similar gift of pretending we're chartered until there's a reason why we're not, so that we don't have to iterate in a fork. We can iterate in core, but could continue. And I guess that kind of leads into my second point, which was the original question of the role of the group moving forward. Mm-hmm. I think that despite the fact that all of us have had and will still have a lot of learning and growing to do about debate, discussion, consensus, personal interaction, and so on, myself included, we all represent varying forms of expertise. We represent various use cases and different constituents. And even if there is a lone objector to things, which there have been multiple times from multiple people, mm-hmm. That typically represents a larger constituency. And it's useful to have that feedback. And even if we get better at not being lone objectors, or we get better at persuading lone objectors and so on and so forth. But so I think it would be a loss if this group did not continue to contribute those perspectives and support and represent those users and use cases moving forward, regardless of where the work is done and regardless of charter status and so on. It's clear, based on the last meeting alone, that we have some adjustments to that we should try to make. But I think that we're capable of making them, and I think that it's worth at least a good faith effort on all of our parts to try and do so before we do something that is effectively dissolving the group and, you know, altering the venue. Okay. Jeffrey, you had your hand up?
I don't have something so broad as that to say. I was just going to say, like, my only concern about this would be, like, I think that a value that this group adds is debating design decisions, like how we're going to handle interop, how we're going to handle file extensions, you know, all those types of things. And like, if anyone just starts throwing PRs against core to change things with regards to ESM, we have no idea that it's going to be within the, like, design parameters that we have in mind or that we've fought so hard to reach a consensus on. So I guess that's my question, is, like, is there some way we can kind of limit the scope of, like, if we drop the moratorium, is there some way we can limit the scope of, like, no, that doesn't fit into the plan or something like that?
So, I mean, a few things that I can think of right off the top of my head as a way of, like, working. So just kind of like reviewing what's in the modules, repo itself, right? Within I believe it's in our governance doc right now, it says consensus seeking process, merging PRs into this repository or Node.js ECMAScript modules. And this is kind of what we're talking about. And it says this does not apply to Node.js core. It only applies to the modules repo and ECMAScript modules. Pull requests not included under the special exemptions below must reach consensus in a meeting in order to be merged into the repository. The special exemptions were errata, editorial, meeting minutes, updates to the team, doc fixes, tests, and fixing rebase conflicts. So we didn't, for example, in there have bug fixes. We didn't, for example, in there have error message changes or other type things. I think that, like, overall, I guess what I'm suggesting is that we remove the Node.js / ECMAScript modules bit from here altogether. We pare down the special exemptions to be about changes to the modules repo, which is much more about, like, our process and governance and a lot less, and about what we reach consensus on about what we're going to work on. And perhaps what we could even do is make it as simple as the request could be a moratorium on not straying from our main doc, which is like the phases doc. Would people be okay with that as perhaps an intermediary? So we have this plan for new modules implementation. We have phase 3, and phase 3 is pretty explicit about the things that we have consensus on, as well as what we need to reach consensus on. So perhaps what we could do, and, like, we could do this between now and the next meeting, is, and maybe the moratorium actually could be even more explicit, to please don't land anything that is related to the things that need consensus in our doc. And I think it's pretty reasonable to assume as well that, like, the number of members that we have in this group that have commitments upstream will act in good faith to just, as Gus says, put a red X on PRs that perhaps are not in line with this, and we could wait between meetings to handle those things that are kind of out of line. Does anyone have any concerns with that as perhaps an iteration to how we've been working?
Okay, I just want to mention really quickly. So I'm not sure if that really answered Jeffrey's question. So I want to do it a little bit more directly. So Node Core doesn't really have a way of owning, like, a subsystem in that kind of way, where you can, where, like, it needs to go through, like, a separate process per se. You can do that with working groups, but it's still a little hand wavy, and we can, well, things will. naturally evolve a little bit out of our kind of like the ideas that we've had over a long period of time, pretty much regardless of what we do. But you know, there's people also are also going to like respect the people that come in and contribute the code and talk about things and all the issues.
Salah, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I guess I'm trying to figure out, you know, from what I'm hearing, I actually want to first, I guess, second Jeffrey's idea of, I'll put in my own words, having the group so far has allowed us some insight if there is anything related to the focus that this group works on happening in core. Like it wasn't always the case, but many times there were issues that related somehow that were brought to our attention because we were there. And I think this kind of, you know, scoped distillation of things that happen in core, and there are a lot of things that happen, is something that would be beneficial to continue to have. If there's a PR happening and we are not aware, is not the same thing as being aware and choosing to be okay with it and not even, you know, have anything to object about or bring to, you know, to the attention of the core team working on the PR. Like, just keeping us in the loop in a structured way is something that I cannot imagine how it's going to pan out when we change the structure. And I'm concerned about that part.
So, I mean, so to what you're saying there, like, and then Gus, you can chime in next. Generally, the way that core works is people are constantly triaging a barrage of issues and pull requests that are coming in and adding the teams that are experts in that space. And it is highly unlikely, but it is possible, but it is highly unlikely that something would go through on the tracker that involves ESM that would not add modules. It's just like you defer to the experts in a space. And if it added modules, all of us would get a ping. And I'm sure that if it was something that's controversial, myself or Gus or Guy or any of you that have the ability to would put a clear red X if this is something the team should talk about. And that is a little bit more in line with how Upstream currently works, even for things that are not necessarily working groups. So like, bear with me while I give a small example. Inspector is by no means at all like a working group, but I believe, and I'm just going to double check right now to make sure I'm not giving an example that isn't true, but I believe that there's an inspector team. There's a V8 inspector team with 5 members. And if something came in that was a pull request against inspector, that team is getting added just because we want the people who are considered to be the experts to be chiming in. And not everyone on that team is necessarily always a member of core, but there's kind of just this unspoken expectation that those that are will make sure that they are operating in good faith. And this isn't a huge difference from how we have done things, but it is drastically different from kind of the idea that we don't land anything that hasn't gone to a meeting, and does rely on us kind of having trust as a group that we will usher things through in an appropriate way.
All right, so that really helps. Thank you so much for clarifying. The last bit was, what would it take to get chartered if that's on the roadmap, if that's actually considered not to be on the roadmap?
The first thing, to be really harsh about it, convincing me that the group should be chartered and having me sponsor a charter with the TSC, which at this moment, to be very blunt, I'm not confident in doing. But I do not see that as something that we cannot get to. For example, if we can work from where we are right now to phase 3 and unflag and not have, you know, the kind of conflicts and problems that had arisen to get to phase 2, I would be more confident. And it doesn't even mean we need to get there. And I want to apologize that is a very carrot stick model of doing it. And that's not my intention, but I'm just trying to like set really clear like goals of things we could do. And it's possible that we get there sooner. Another thing would be potentially re-examining our governance and restructuring our governance to be one that works for this problem space in this group. For example, I was recently informed about a governance methodology known as rough consensus. The idea with rough consensus is that if as a group we cannot reach consensus on an issue, we try to figure out if we have rough consensus, which is then you have a separate conversation about if we have consensus that we have rough consensus. And it's a bit of kind of this meta thing, but I think the general idea is that if you have the same people blocking to consensus as you do to rough consensus, then you actually have rough consensus. And it's very possible that people who don't block or disagree with a change may still think that we need to spend more time working on something. And so there may be really a possibility that we explore new governance models that allow us to handle some of these consensus problems that we have had. And to be honest, these are problems that exist in kind of all groups that have lots of different people with different needs. And, you know, it could be really cool if we can go and start like exploring rough consensus as a model, document it as governance, start doing it and find, hey, actually, we can get through all these decisions that used to be extremely contentious and make it work. I would feel totally confident in chartering us. And not only that, I'd probably go and take this idea of rough consensus and we could bring it back to core and be like, hey, is this a model we want to explore? In fact, we may even go to TC39, who has had consensus issues, and say, hey, is this something you want to explore? It doesn't mean these other groups would want to do it, but I mean, like, for me to feel comfortable chartering it, I would want to be like so proud of the work that we've done and so proud of how we've done it that I want it to be a model that other groups augment towards.
Okay, I think we have consensus about rough consensus. So,
and you know what? I'll be honest. From the ups and downs that I have, I think that if it sounds like we have some rough consensus around augmenting right now how we interact with core and perhaps a bit of a better idea of what that work looks like. I can take a stab at modifying some of our governance documents to reflect what we discussed today. And then separately, I'm going to be doing some research into rough consensus. There's a document that I can send out to other people. And perhaps we want to explore a different consensus model as a group, because perhaps it has just been our governance that has also failed us, because consensus seeking as a whole is fairly rigid. And in a space, we were talking about this over lunch today, modules is one of those things where it's like you change one small thing and the calculus for everything else changes. So it's really hard to maintain consistent consensus, and it's really exhausting when you need to just consistently be revisiting things and relitigating things, but it's also impossible to kind of avoid it. So I think that was a really long-winded way of saying we can do better, and I think that we can. And I inflected upwards on both of them. Does that answer your question, Salah?
oh, definitely. And I really appreciate the very deep insights. And again, I'm looking forward to making the right adjustments to the process, because definitely there is the motivation. There's always good insight. And I believe we definitely can do better. So thanks.
And perhaps maybe a way of framing this, and to kind of Jeff's last comment here, he was thinking about PRs from people outside our group, and he's fine what I proposed, but perhaps we can direct out people who aren't part of the group to open an issue in modules if it involves kind of changing the proposal. Perhaps what we can think of ourselves as, and this is just a framing, is stewards of the roadmap. And if things stray from that roadmap, that is when we as a group get together to make sure that we're augmenting the roadmap to match the changes that are happening. Is that something that people feel comfortable with?
Like specific implementation stuff about like how C++ is written or how the JavaScript is written, like that's the business of Node collaborators, not the modules group.
Or even like the name of an error message.
Yeah, exactly.
Is like, that is separate from, like, I guess there's a difference of like the law and the spirit of the law.
Yeah.
And like we maintain the spirit of the roadmap.
I mean, I think we may have an opinion on user observable things like names, but like, but I think that largely that's implementation details. The roadmap, as it, which to me describes the like feature plans as well as semantics as well as the implications of decisions. Like that's the sort of thing I think we should be directing and stewarding, as you put it.
Okay, cool. I feel very comfortable and confident with this kind of iteration on our mindset. And obviously, we're only 14 people of the group right now. There's more people who should, we'll have to figure this out. I'll just kind of send this back to all of you for a second. I'm usually the first one to jump and like kind of shoulder governance related stuff. Would anyone else like to take the action item on adjusting the governance to kind of reflect what we just discussed?
I mean, I'm happy to help you, but I think if you need to do the research about the rough consensus and so on. So I think you need to certainly be involved.
More explicitly, not the rough consensus side of things, more the updating to reflect kind of the new non-moratorium that we're discussing. So we need to update the governance document to no longer refer to ECMAScript modules, and we need to like rechange what the scope is and document that like changes that are in line with the roadmap don't require our group to intervene. Is there anyone who would like to take on kind of documenting that? Okay, I'll do it. Not everyone all at once. Okay, cool. So
I mean,
we have.
I can to some extent be, part of that, but I will have some questions, so so we can iterate if that's okay.
Yeah, I don't think it will take too long. I'm at TC39 meetings for the next 2 days, and it's a great time to get work done. Okay, so I think that's enough to kind of wrap up that discussion for now. Thank you all for kind of, listening and being open to feedback and being mature about the iterations here. I'm feeling really positive about the direction that we're pointing towards. So the first issue that I wanted to bring up for us to discuss today, because this is one that is time sensitive, is locking down the process and buffer globals. Guy, do you want to introduce this?
Yeah, we've discussed it a few times before. So I had a PR up on Node Core and an approach that works to deprecate these globals within ECMAScript modules only. And what we did to just kind of get something through for now was just pushed up making the process and buffer globals getters in Node.js. Which is effectively just the breaking change part of that entire proposal, and then we can follow up with the proposal itself. Yeah, I also introduced it at the SCS meeting, and Mark Miller had a look at the approach as well and verified the security properties, which was quite nice. Yeah, I'm not sure what more there is to say about it now. I will be updating that PR to reflect what we got in, but at this point, it's more something that's going to be happening over the coming months as opposed to right now necessarily. If anyone has any questions on it.
Just a chime in, and then Jordan has a question. I just quickly took a peek at Canary in the Gold Mine, and it does not appear like there's any ecosystem breakages, at least in our smoke testing suite, related to this. It looks like, and I'm just double checking, that in general, the breakages that we were seeing are the same ones for, like, there's no difference between the breakages on master for 12 and changing these two objects into getters. Also, just kind of like some historical context for people. We have made several major changes before that have landed that we did not think would be disruptive and turned it out to be like, oh, well, that was a mistake. Jeremiah probably remembers the time we changed how RealPath worked. I was waiting for him to laugh really loudly. But
oh, yeah, I gave a talk on that stuff.
Yeah, this is just talk fodder. So if we break everything, it's good. But December major changes like this can be reverted in a patch if they prove to be destructive in the ecosystem in ways that were unexpected. So just to kind of give people an idea of what the table stakes here of this change are, our smoke test suite does not show any real risk of ecosystem breakage across over 100 plus of heavily relied on modules that touch all different types of things within our ecosystem. And so there's no real way at this point for us to know what kind of big breakages there would be aside from pushing it out and crossing our fingers and then reverting quickly if we find out that we did something really bad. Jordan, you had something to add?
Yeah, so I think I've made it relatively clear that through this whole thing, that I think buffer is fine to deprecate because there's tons of reasons why that's not going to break anybody, and anyone who does is probably already broken in some ways. I'm very concerned about process. The general response I've gotten from Guy is there's a lot of stuff on process that's unsafe. I am fine with removing those things, but that it will be hard to remove them individually. And so we're going with the easier thing of removing all of process. And I think the risk of breakage in the ways you described, Miles, is much higher with process because it is consistently used for environment detection. Mm-hmm. This is the sort of thing that I went through with the global this proposal, where I did a code search and looked through 98 pages of GitHub results and at all the usages of global I could find. And it seemed like it would be fine. And then I broke yahoo.com. And when Firefox shipped it, and things like that, people have been using type of process for environment detection for a very long time. So I'm very concerned about shipping any form of deprecation of that. And I think it would be, even though it's more work, I think it would be, and even if for expediency's sake, we temporarily kept the process global out of ESM while we worked on deprecating the dangerous parts so that we could put a process without the dangerous parts in ESM, I would be fine with that plan too. I think that it would be a wiser long-term thing to persist the process global, but individually address the unsafe parts.
And to be clear, this PR is not changing any of that. It's just making the process global a getter.
Right.
Which is the December major change we would need to do
totally
to make any future change.
Yeah, and I'm not, I have spiritual concerns about the PR because of the direction it implies, but not because of that specific PR. What the PR has evolved into is something that does not trigger the concerns that I have. In its initial form, it did.
Yeah.
So I'm not suggesting that PR not be merged or anything like that. But I would really encourage Guy, you in particular, but the group in general and the TSC, there are the collaborators on the call to consider the potentially wide-ranging ecosystem impacts, not just in Node, but in browser bundles that have relied on processes' existence to make websites work, and documentation, as has pointed out. I think that's just a really, it's a really fundamental core thing to strip off just because there's a few things we don't like on it. And I would much rather move those things off.
We also aren't going to have dir name and file name though. So
sure. No, and that's true.
Guy, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just a few clarifications. Firstly, the PR, so yeah, we split up into a smaller PR, which just made process and buffer getters, which was just the bare minimum part. And that's already merged on master, so that's in. And that basically opens the door for this. If that hadn't gone through and weren't to land in Node 12, then yeah, this is impossible, and it's never possible to have secure modules in Node without dropping or without cutting off the ecosystem from the module that you're in. So it's kind of, yeah, I mean, look, you can talk about the security properties for ages. I hope people have read up on these kind of security properties in their own time. But the main thing about the to respond to Jordan's argument, adding a global is a very, very, very different thing. These are firstly, websites that expect much more backwards compatibility, and they're actually, it's running code. This change does not affect any running code in the wild. No existing Node.js code is affected by this change. It's only the new model code, and that's kind of the whole point, is that we can jump onto these new semantics. It's a great point that Jordan raises about the process environment checks, process.environment.node environment.
Well, I'm even just talking about determining the platform based on the existence of the global alone,
right? So
not even any of the properties on it.
And these are the sort of checks that we can think about. We could create our own process global that's different in ESM, that is a new object that just has the bare minimum like process.platform, and then it's a secure process that's specific to ESM. Or we could do things like have import.meta.platform, import, and then if you do direct equality with it, you can checks against that, or import.meta.node environment, and these kinds of things. I can see Wesley is typing away here about the point I made about things that are already written as ES module syntax that relies on process. I think we can accept that there's going to be some kind of some kind of stage where code that previously, like one example is the module field in package.json, a whole bunch of things expected to work and it's not going to work. And that's something that's going to have to hit, and people are going to have to hit that and realize it. And named exports is another one that people are going to have to hit it, realize it doesn't work, and change their code. There will be a few things like that. And yes, this could potentially be one of those things.
So, Salah, you have something to add, and then we are at 3:48. And the CI is green. So Salah, after your point, I would like to ceremoniously land the phase 2 commit on master while live streaming, because I don't know, it just sounds fun. So Salah, go for it.
Yeah, so just before we move on, I think it would be very, very fair to say that this group has to come up with an agreed approach moving forward for syntax detection of Node in ESM without relying on process. Also, I'd like to second Guy mentioning that this does not break CJS in the wild today, definitely. I attended the SES presentation and I looked into it. The only problem it creates is for ES syntax doing a type of process. If process is ever completely removed from global, which would be in ESM modules here. So code that runs as ESM, depending on process, is like flagged experimental so far. People have to revise it. So yeah.
Okay. So are you all ready?
Do it.
Let's see, share my screen. I'll just share my whole screen. Hopefully, give me 1 second. I'm just going to close all the things that are going to leak confidential information. Basically every chat I have. That would have been a good one to show up. Like literally just got a super confidential. Let me have my notifications snoozed. Do not disturb on. That's a good one. Okay, cool. Targos, you have your hand up?
Yeah. Right now I'm preparing the next 11.x release, which will be 11.13. Do we want the new ESM implementation in there?
Yeah, why not?
I'm always in favor of backporting everything possible as far back as possible.
I guess the only thing would be, and maybe include it in, when are you going to push the PR? Like today?
Probably, yes.
The only hesitation that I have with it is that there are people who are running things in production, potentially on 11, that are relying on ESM. And even though we have said, yes, this can change at any time, the difference that we're talking about is like a certain number of weeks. And I think that it might be better to not pull the rug out from underneath people. At the very least, we're going to have another 11 release before then. and I think I would like this to bake on master a little bit beforehand. So at the very least, let's wait one release. Does anyone object to that?
That sounds fine. I just want to point out that I think for experimental things, it's useful to pull the rug out from people and remind them that that's what experimental means. Like, not capriciously, but like, this is, it's fine. And this way, like, you know, more versions of Node will have the ability for people to experiment with the latest implementation. But waiting a release for it to bake seems fine to me too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so get Node land.
Just somewhere sort of in between two, to not like wait additional weeks.
Mm-hmm.
You know what? I'm not going to use get node land because I'm too lazy to figure out what's broken. So get the metadata here. There we go. Look at all those checks. And then the commit.
After you amend the commit, you should push it to the PR. And it'll get a real merge instead of a red close.
Of course, with lease, because it is the best feature. For those of you watching at home, this is not how we usually do it.
Are we supposed to see anything on the screen?
I guess it's getting cut off. Can you all see that on the stream?
Yep.
Would everyone who's in the room with me want to touch the button at the same time? So 1, 2, 3.
This is like when you sign your names in the circle at immunity, so none of you can be executed.
We've done it, everyone. We just launched phase 2. Congratulations.
Woo-hoo! And we just launched phase 1, for that matter.
Yeah, we launched it all. Okay. We have 7 minutes left. I think we should just end on this positive note. I don't know if there's too much more that we can really dig into. Jeffrey was talking about the type stuff and how we all have opinions. I think we should maybe try to do an out-of-band meeting next week if people have time. Jeff, would you like to maybe make a doodle for that and open an issue?
Yeah, if I could just say one thing about that, that's, you know, I'm surprised no one, or not surprised, I'm glad no one from upstream blocked on it, but there were several comments on the upstream PR of people confused by it and it not behaving the way they expected. So I think we need to address that one way or another. And so, yeah, I think we should have a meeting dedicated to that and figure out what we want to do.
I think that feedback should also be included with usage feedback, though. So we may want to give it a little time for to figure out if that's just confusion from a few collaborators or if that confusion is echoed in user feedback, because that makes a stronger case for it if it is.
Yeah, can we distill that feedback next week and make it so that when we get user feedback, we're able to you know, validate what we heard, what Jeffrey is concerned about. I think you know, framing what we would expect as user feedback can help us actually look for the right user feedback in the right way.
Let's at least meet about it. I don't think we need to wait like weeks and weeks, if you guys don't mind.
No, yeah, we can talk about it sooner. I just pointing out that user feedback will help inform the discussion.
Sure.
Yeah, and once this gets out, and that could be a reason for trying to get this out in 11, would be getting some user feedback and iterating on it sooner than later and finding out where people are getting tripped up. I'm tweeting about it right now. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. I am going to suggest that we go ahead and just call it. Does anyone have any last minute bits to add to the meeting, or can we go ahead and spin it down?
I think that it would be, I really am hopeful that all of us are not disenchanted with this group and this process, despite the fact that we've had many difficult discussions and it's come to a head recently. I hope that we can all continue to work together and have more of these positive moments.
They feel good, don't
Yeah,
they?
it's always nice.
Right on.
Thanks everybody for your patience and efforts.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the